So let's discuss this case out of New York, the killing of Deborah Danner, a 66-year-old woman in the Bronx who was having a mental health episode last October. Police responded, and Sergeant Hugh Barry ended up shooting and killing her, and he has now been charged with second-degree murder and first and second-degree assault in New York. And I know that you and I have been discussing a number of issues, but let's focus today on the police response. And do you want to talk about this in terms of the police response to the call or the police response to the shooting and the aftermath?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines of the aftermath, because that's the first thing that struck me in reviewing this. And I feel like it's something that we're kind of seeing on a broader concept, that people are calling for empathy, but it's not a universal empathy. It's only an empathy as far as regards to their team and their tribalism. Mm-hmm. And when we see it on the police side, it kind of stands out for us. So I went to the GoFundMe, and I can see that it's up to $29,000 right now, and it was started by a cop that worked with him. And when we, in the public, we see that there's $29,000 being raised for a crime suspect, which is absolutely appalling to us to hear. And it's another one of those things where if the tables were reversed, what would the police be doing? So can we imagine if there was a $29,000 GoFundMe being raised for somebody who had killed a cop? I mean, most cops sit there and will use what's his name? Muammar Abdul-Jabbar. What's his name? Get it for me. Fix it.
The guy from Philadelphia, Mumia Abu Jamal.
Right. So cops will use his name like he is the penultimate demon, and they don't even know the details of the case. They just know the name. And so imagine if there was that kind of money being raised for a suspect that killed like him, and the police would be going crazy because they know that's wrong. But I think why they're getting this way is that tribalism. So in a broad concept, this is like the police officer's biggest fear. And that fear is rooted in that input and output misalignment that we talk about, and why policing overall is wrong, right? So the fundamental concept of this is that the officer is being told to do one thing. And then when they're in that situation and it goes wrong, that the world and the output is being judged by the community, but that input came in from somebody else. So you don't have police even talking about this, and it's just kind of maybe like people in general, we kind of bottle things up and it's just an explosion. So this feels like the pent-up explosion of what police are dealing with. And so they don't whistleblow about these kind of things because they have no safe avenues to do this, because they would be jeopardizing their families. So that's what this guy feels like they're doing now when they're raising these funds. That's what they're talking about. Like, look, this guy has a family. He has a job that he was told to do. This could happen to any one of us. So they're naturally going to rally around this concept, and in that if they can be there and don't stand up, then what happens when they're in those shoes? If I don't know, you know what I'm trying to say? It's like you get gripped into this tribalism, and it's expressed. So like the Sergeants Benevolent Association, they put out a GoFundMe and kind of consolidated everything. And it says, he was outrageously charged with the murder and the shooting death of an emotionally disturbed woman who attacked him with a baseball bat in October of 2016. And that since his arrest, he has been suspended without pay. And so you're already, they're already entrenching themselves in the tone. So the police, who know to be objective in an investigation, they're already putting out there in the public, outrageously charged with murder with an emotionally disturbed woman who attacked him with a baseball bat. These people aren't there either. So they're just setting these kind of tribalistic tones out in the society. And the law enforcement officers, the unions, they all get this twisted, and it comes out in their tribal mentality now, because if we were doing these things, they would normally be fighting for what? For somebody that was charged with murder to be held in prison for as long as possible, they would be praising the idea of urban charging and doing all the lesser charges so that everything would be included all at once and they could go after these people. They would be like going mad if somebody was got out on bail because there was they were able to post things and the judge let them go free. So all these things are the exact opposites what they already normally agree with, because this isn't like willful ignorance. This is active ignorance to protect their own careers because of these systems.
So let me ask this question, because in the last episode we talked a bit about the structure of policing, the question of whether it should be an arm of the state or an arm of society, but also the idea that perhaps for policing, the policing has sort of become an end in itself, and it's not really attached to goals or outcomes. And so you go and you do this job, and you do it because this is what we do as police, and it's not really tied to anything broader than the act of power and authority on the street. And so I'm curious from your perspective, and in light of sort of that conversation that we had in the previous episode, and then in light of this sort of tribalism that you're describing now with respect to the GoFundMe, how do you see the police defining their role? Do they see themselves as an arm of the society? Do they see themselves as an arm of the state? Or do they see themselves as almost an independent third party in the question of the relationship of the other two terms to one another?
Yeah, so I think that's like kind of our juxtaposition of what the real motivation is. I'm really projecting, of course, but I feel like as police, we tell ourselves that we do it for these good reasons, and we make up these concepts, but really it comes down to exactly what you're saying, that it's like just us and your crew versus the thems, but the thems are real like complicated. I feel like the thems are really just the people that are disagreeing with your construct of what policing is and the law and order, and maybe quiet, not necessarily justice, that people actually want quiet because like that's what the police are fighting for. And I really think that police are the most dramatic expression of our society, and the most obvious, like when it really comes down to it, it's like dragging the methodology and using the Socratic method to get all the way down to the root. Because at the root, like these are the expressions. When they're talking about, they're bitching about how their officer is kind of being treated like everybody else. And then when cops are treated with extra rights, the public says, hey, what the hell? They should be treated just as bad as we do. That both of those positions are incredibly wrong, and that everyone should be getting treated as well as we can treat every single one of those groups, not always trying to make sure the other person gets less. So when we have that idea that every person gets less, and we're trying to punish the cops and not really trying to look at solutions either, as a society, we are turning to violence when we want to put these cops in prisons, and we call that justice. We're turning to an unjust system that we know can't seek justice, thinking it will get justice, because what we really want is vengeance on the person that did something to us. So are we fighting to be the oppressor, or are we fighting to end oppression? I think that gets confused on all of those sides. When these officers are giving money to these GoFundMes to defend him, they may completely disagree with the evidence of the case at hand, but they know that they can end up being in that exact same spotlight. So they want to know that no matter how bad it looks for them, they won't be abandoned. Like they're used to watching, like the department abandons officers that cross the line and throws them away because we're not looking for actual solutions. And then their friends and families and their own emotional turmoil they go over with the reality of policing, like in the spotlight. They know they go to police every day, and when they see bad things that look bad on all the cops, like inside their minds, they know this is going on. They have to be facing tremendous internal conflict, and that becomes an exhausting effort. So you even band together more. It's like I want to just scream from the rooftop, like stop, 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 with all these weird paradigms of fighting one another.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the them in some ways includes both the public, but also the politicians. And, you know, we've had conversations on the podcast about the way police are pawns in a broader system. But what you said about, in some ways, the police being a purer reflection of the society and its demands for vengeance, I think that's why this question of do we think of police as an arm of the state versus an arm of the society? And then what does that mean? Because if we want them, or we think that police should be an arm of the society, it implies the question of what are society's values then that police are supposed to act out. And what you're pointing out in criticizing those who would think of addressing police reform issues purely from or primarily from the perspective of punishing what they see as rogue cops, I guess, or punishing cops who misbehave, it does raise the question of, when we as a society demand vengeance and then our agents enact vengeance, who are we to cry abuse?
Yeah, so that's the quiet or the justice thing. That's what I mean by that. So we say that we want justice, and that would be the police being the arm of society. Because if we were fighting for justice, that would be noisy. What we actually want is quiet. So that's why we support the police being the arm of the state, because that's also what the state wants. The state wants quiet. The state wants to do what it will do. Well, you just go along and are a peaceful and quiet indentured servant within the system.
I mean, let me ask this, because I think for me, part of the problem is the demand for justice, because to me, justice is a juridical concept. And so it's strictly tied to the idea of jus, law. And so to me, justice can only be adjudicated on the basis of established or existing law. And I think that sometimes when a society we demand justice, we're not actually looking or asking for the operation of the law to be applied to a particular situation. A lot of times we have some sort of moral or ethical notion in mind that we think of as justice, but we are limited in part because of our history and our vocabulary to articulating that idea in a sort of juridical notion. So in the language of the power and operation of the state. And so I worry that for persons who claim they want justice, that they might not realize what they're asking for in raising that term, and that they might have to be more specific about what they're actually claiming. Because I think when a lot of people say justice, what they actually mean is, I want this series of values to inform the operation of our laws or the structure of our laws, but they're not referring to laws themselves. And so I think oftentimes what we've seen when the legal system or the legal process plays out in the instances of police brutality, where oftentimes the cops get off, that is the operation of the law. And so that is justice. And that might not be the thing that you're actually asking for.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're right kind of in the concept that it can come through law, or it should come through law. It's just that we actually haven't codified that properly. So we would be fighting to constantly monitor and have subjectivity and looseness in what we have codified to be able to readily adapt that. That's the only way that it could get through law, because we just can't move fast enough. So that's why I would argue it has to be more subjective in an environment of chaos and in the global context where we're just going to advance concepts too rapidly in order to codify them to a long-established procedure. And I will object that they actually don't want justice in the way you say. I think what I hear is that people want procedural justice all the time, and that's a very different thing. That is a quality. So that's why they're comfortable with arguing that they want other people to be treated just as bad as they are, more than the work of you being treated just as well as those people. It's much easier to punish and rely on pulling other people down like crabs in a barrel or some silly thing like that. That's what I see. I see us looking for equality, not actually justice, because justice might not be equal, and we have in our idea that that's what it should be. So, for instance, like in these crimes that we have codified in our morality, for him being charged in this instance as Sergeant Barry for murder with intent. So criminal element always has to have intent, and we kind of get that when we're dealing with regular human beings. And so we say, well, they have to have intent to do this. So we have to prove intent, and that's what codifies part of this crime, is the intent to do it. Well, you're almost completely absent that in a real defined argument in policing, because their intent was to do a job, and their job sent them to that thing. So it's almost impossible to always prove intent. And if our job is to protect the public from someone's intent, then all you would have to do was remove the forced intent from the public of a police officer in order to get justice, which would be preventing that thing from ever occurring again. So these things get super complicated when we really narrow it down. So that's why I think people don't want to be pushed on what the actual definition is, because when they turn inside, they're going to find out that their definition is vengeance.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that their definition is vengeance. I mean, what I worry that people don't realize, though, is that from a technical standpoint, procedural justice is when, for example, an officer kills Michael Brown and the prosecutor decides not to pursue charges. Procedural justice is when, in the case of the Baltimore Six, a number of officers are tried and they're found not guilty, or the cases are dropped in the case of the remaining officers who didn't end up facing a trial. Procedural justice only requires a process, right? It doesn't require an outcome. And so...
right, it requires an equal process, though.
Yeah, but I mean, equal really at that point just means structured under the same set of laws. And, you know, depending on how those laws are structured in the particular context, they might articulate a separate process for law enforcement officers than they might for standard civilians. And so appealing to law or justice, which is the same thing ultimately, is essentially saying that you want the legal process to play out, which is what has happened. And so when we're actually saying what we want is justice, is vengeance, we're asking for something different.
What are we going to define justice as?
I mean, I think justice needs to be defined very strictly and narrowly in terms of its relation to law, which is, you know, it's sort of etymological construct, you might say, or it's sort of a contextual history, is that justice is strictly tied to the notion of ius, I-U-S, you know, the Roman notion of law. And that's where we get these words like justice. And so we tend to use justice in our setting in a sort of a moral or ethical sense. But in a pluralistic setting, that's not a useful construct for justice, because my morals and my values need not be your morals and your values. My morals and values might be defined by religious tradition X. Your morals and values might be defined by secular tradition Y. And so when we talk about justice in this sort of abstract moral way, not actually as tied to law, I think we're often just projecting ourselves as the measure of right and wrong. And I think that when that is occurring, when we're saying we're the measure of our right and wrong, and that's our definition of justice, then, you know, the police are essentially mirroring our own attitude about the way right and wrong stems from your own perception when they are abusive on the streets. Because in that moment, they're making themselves the measure of right and wrong in the same way that we've made ourselves the measure of right and wrong.
I hear you, but I think that whole argument is a bit of a circular logic in the way that, like in the Freddie Gray case with fear in policing, we have now codified into law that the average officer is reasonable, and therefore if the average officer is fearful, then it's reasonable for an officer to be fearful. So if we turn to the law as its thing of justice, then justice must be a premise of that law, and our law is unjust. So if we're turning to a law that is fundamentally unjust as our measure of justice, then we have a circular logic of what justice is. That's why I would break it away, and that justice is a progress in the efforts to prevent the harm from recurring. And I think you can even sell that to victims. So justice for Tamir Rice isn't anything other than every bit of effort in making sure that Tamir, if he had survived, that didn't happen to him, and that it would happen, that those situations would never reoccur.
I mean, the problem for me with that definition of the term justice is that if somebody has a different opinion of what the outcome should have been, then they'll sort of say that they'll articulate a different version of justice. That's why I think, when we talk about justice in these terms, which are sort of more morally abstract and they're not tied specifically to a set of laws, we end up using a rhetorical tool that doesn't serve our purpose, because now we're in a sphere where everybody's individual morality is being implicated by the term justice. And so we're never going to get to a specific outcome. And so you're right that the relationship is strictly is circular in the way that law and justice are then strictly tied together. But I don't think the solution is to separate the two concepts. I think you leave them tied, and then you ask whether we need to have different values informing the law, the values that we want to evoke somewhat abstractly when we say justice, but without an actual sort of objective standard that justice can then conform to. Because I think that's the challenge of using the word justice rhetorically, is that you have to articulate what those values are that determine whether something is just or unjust. And if that value isn't just whatever the law is, then we're just putting ourselves in the position of being the measure of right and wrong. And now we have to enter into the impossible task of arguing, publicly and with the society about whose values should prevail.
Yeah, I think we do that anyway, and I don't think I object to that.
No, I mean, I think we do that, but I think that's why the conversation often doesn't go anywhere, right? Because like when you say justice and when the Sergeant Benevolence Association says justice, you're using the same word, but you have two very different contents. And so at least when we let justice be strictly tied to the idea of law, the way I think it should be, then you're not arguing over the content of justice. You can argue over the values that inform our laws, which is really the political argument.
Why can't I argue to change the definition of justice to mine then?
No, I mean, my only problem is that like when we think of justice as in sort of more morally abstract terms, there's no way to adjudicate between two visions of justice, right? So if I think X is just and you think X is unjust.
My definition of just is exactly the same in its outcome for Sergeant Barry here as it is for Miss Deborah. It's the same.
Yeah, but it might not be the same as my definition of justice and the outcomes that I demand on the basis.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, but that's my point. Is like now we're in the space of like you either believe Mike and his values or you don't, and we're trying to, on the basis of your possession of those values, create a broader normative principle that others should follow. Including the operation of our processes in the state. And but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that Mike is not the measure of truth and law. And so then we have to acknowledge that now we're in the political realm. We're just using a rhetorical term to argue for our perspective, not to argue for a matter as technical as justice. We're not really talking about justice. We're saying which values should inform the idea of justice.
God, we could go off on a different paths. I just don't think that justice is I think it is subjective. I don't think it is something that should be tied down and strictly codified. So, I just don't think I object to that.
I mean, I understand that but would you still find it a useful term then if it's subjective and everybody can have their own definition as a standard for judging the outcomes of real world situations? I think that's the problem, is like when you let justice be a sort of strictly subjective abstract notion, it starts to lose its authority for real world application in the way that you mean. Like I think it deprives justice of content.
But we codify words. So codify that justice is the effort to prevent these things from recurring. That can be the new definition of justice, and everything else can be built upon it. We can still argue about our own values because we can argue about the methodology of getting there, but we can agree that we're all going for the same goal at least, and that is what a society does. So I feel that we get into these kind of concepts where it's like, are we listening to Mike? And it's like, no, it's not listening to Mike. It's listening to Mike's idea and thinking if we should put that idea into a broader, more generalized social construct. That's it. It's not, so don't listen to me because towards me. Listen to me because it's the idea, and it would be better for society if we operated under this construct, even though it might not be completely true, because it doesn't matter if it's completely true. It matters if it's the best way to operate in our environment.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't believe in the completely true. So, it's not even a question for me of whether Mike is wrong or right. And so, I think in that way we converge, and that what is necessary is for there to be a political discussion about what those values are and how they should operate and what outcomes we are searching for and why those outcomes, on the basis of which values we prefer those outcomes. And I think if we had that discussion, we'd be in a very different place.